Oh, NASCAR fantasy racing fans, welcome to this week's edition of Dan Beaver's NASCAR Fantasy Pit Stop. I'm Charlie Turner. He is Dan Beaver down in Texas. How you doing, Dan?
I'm doing great, but it's a hat day, so that gives you some idea of what's going on down here.
A little warm, is it?
No, it just means too busy to do all those other, like
Oh,
make
those
myself
things.
presentable.
I see. I was going to say, we're having a string of, and a predicted string of probably the nicest weather we'll have all year, right? We're right in the middle of it. 70, 72 degrees every day and sunny been for the last couple of days and it's supposed to be for the next 5 or 6. So hopefully that weather extends over east to our next Sprint Cup venue, which is Dover International Speedway over on the East Coast. I know one of my favorite tracks, I think one of yours as well. We've talked about this a number of times. But before we get to the actual fantasy talk and tips for this weekend's race, there are a couple of things that hit the news today that may, I'll ask you whether they affect choices this week and going forward. One was that late yesterday, I guess, was announced by the authorities in power that the Tony Stewart case is basically being dropped. No charges will be brought against Tony, no criminal charges. And I think that's good news for certainly for Tony Stewart and for NASCAR, and I think probably overall for everybody involved.
Yeah, I think it's certainly good news for Stewart. He can get back to business, and he's got a lot of work to do. The team wasn't running particularly well before the tragedy, and they didn't get back to speed. You have to wonder exactly if all the other stuff was still being a distraction, how much of it was a distraction, how much of it is that the team has a lot of work to do. And we still don't know. So whether or not there'll be an immediate impact on his performance is going to be an open question. But this is a good track for him to try to answer that question. And actually, that's one of the themes of Dover this week is there are a lot of drivers that have something to prove, or there are a lot of drivers that are going to use this fantasy owners are going to use this as a base to tell whether or not several of these drivers are actually struggling or moving forward. Tony Stewart's one of those guys because he ran well here in the spring. He missed last fall, but the last time he was here before that, he won. This should be a good track for him if everything's going right. Things haven't been going right, so now we'll find out whether or not it was his legal issues or in tragedy that was affecting him, or whether or not this team's just not ready to contend at the front of the pack. I suspect we're probably going to find out it's second over the next couple of weeks, and the team just has a lot of work to do.
Well, it certainly won't be a negative, and that's good news, I think. The other news today, which I don't know how much it'll affect things now, but Joey Logano has signed a multi-year extension with Penske Racing, so he's going to continue with that team. I can't believe that he was concerned about his status, but at least that's out of the way.
It's out of the way, and the timing of it is notable. I believe I believe it was at least a 2-year contract that he came in under, so he had a full year to go. They didn't have to start talking about this until sometime next year. But on the heels of his victory and Brad Keselowski's victory, it certainly indicates that everything there is about as happy as it's ever going to be, and they want to get everybody looking towards the championship. That, I think, is a positive. Both of those drivers have so much confidence entering this weekend, having won the last 2 races, having won the last 3 races, actually, with Keselowski doubling down before Logano's win, that this is going to be a good weekend for them. And it's always been a good track for Logano. I think he has top 10s in almost 2/3 of his starts there and a 5-race streak. So he's looking to bookend this contract news with a pair of strong top 5 finishes, if not a pair of victories.
Yeah, Joey must be really happy there, because you would think if he still had a year left on his contract that he might have waited, or his people might have waited to renegotiate this extension until after the possibility of winning the Sprint Cup championship this year. You would think that would give him a bit more leverage. Maybe not. I'm sure Roger Penske gave him his best shot as it was. The other news is that Ryan Truex has apparently lost his ride in the number 83 BK Racing car. I don't know that that's huge news, but you have called out Ryan a couple of times when he has been in that car during, more particularly in the Yahoo game in the C driver spot.
Yeah, I think he was a decent rookie. He's always been lagging behind the others. Once Parker Kligerman lost his ride, Ryan Truex became the rookie that was most likely to earn the least points each week. It's kind of bad timing for him because this would have been the race that one of the races that he really wanted to do well in. It's a home track for both him and brother Martin. So I don't know. It's sad that it happened, but it's pretty typical for what happens in large rookie fields. You start off with something like this. We've seen it in the past when we've had fields of 6 plus drivers, and it starts off with a lot of enthusiasm for all the rookies. We get to this stage of the season, and we've lost usually more of them than we've lost now. The number 83 team, the reason that they reportedly let him go was that his feedback wasn't great to the crew. They weren't able to improve the car, and that was they put that on his shoulders instead of the crew chief's shoulders. We got to believe that that was true, but I don't know that the team is ready to contend for top 30 finishes either. So the new driver that comes in, I think last week was Travis Kvapil. I'm not sure who it's going to be this week. I'm not sure if it's been announced yet even. But the new driver is not going to automatically make that team a top 30 team. So they remain somewhat fantasy irrelevant until we find out what's going on.
Yeah, the thing that I find odd about making this kind of change at this point in the season, with that being with the driver feedback communication issue being the stated reason, is how are they going to test whoever gets in that car for feedback, ability to give feedback, to change? I mean, is there an IQ test, a feedback test? What do you do here? I mean, I just there's something that doesn't seem right there.
I think what strikes me is why they wait this long. Obviously,
right.
If Truex was not able to give them appropriate feedback, they should have known it well before the 3/4 mark or wherever we are. So far as the new driver coming in, there are drivers that communicate well with the crew chief, and I think you can figure that out. Travis Kvapil, he's a veteran driver. He's been in other cars. You can talk to the other crew chiefs, and you've got an idea of what kind of feel he's got for the car. Now, I don't know if he's the driver of record this week. I suspect he probably will be, and going forward for a little bit, because someone else is in the 32 this week. So I think you can get that answer. Usually, though, what they do is they put a veteran in for a week or two, and then they don't actually get rid of the other driver. They see whether or not that really was the problem. If they figured it out after 1 week, they were pretty sure it was the problem going into New Hampshire last week, I suspect.
Okay, well, that pretty much covers the news that we've gotten so far early this week. Now let's talk about the race and what fantasy players should do this week at Dover International Speedway, the Monster Mile, one of my favorite tracks. I would usually start the show off talking about salary cap games, so I have no reason to change it up now since we're such a winning show. Let's go forward with what we got.
Yeah, and Dover is a great track to go to, so long as you don't have to get a hotel room anywhere around there. So.
Yeah, that's a fact.
At some point, the hoteliers around there have got to stop gouging the customers, but it's a resort town, so I suppose they're used to gouging one way or another. So, yeah. In salary cap games, we're looking at a track that is fairly predictable when it develops into a rhythm track. The 1 mile tracks, the high bank tracks, typically are rhythm tracks. You think of Phoenix, New Hampshire, and Dover all as being rhythm tracks when we're in one regard or another. Then you think of this as a high bank track still, and Bristol's not quite as high banked as it was. but there's still a little bit of a comparative that can be drawn between the two. Both of those are rhythm tracks. So when the drivers are able to get their rhythm down, this is a track that's prone to streaks. In the last 4 or 5 years, we've had 10 or 11 drivers sweeping the top 15 3 times. So you can look to the top 15 from the FedEx 400 earlier this spring and get a good indication of who's going to run well this week. That we've also got the other theme going on of drivers that need to have a good run in order for us to evaluate whether or not they're struggling or actually are going to turn their season around. In that category, I'd place Jimmy Johnson, Clint Bowyer, Dale Earnhardt Jr., and Casey Kane. 2 drivers with one driver with a great record here. Actually, all 4 of them have great records here recently. One driver with a good record in recent 2014 races. The other 3 drivers, somewhat a little more questionable. But Jimmy Johnson hasn't dominated for victories like he has at other stages of other seasons. Dale Earnhardt Jr. got a top 10 last week, but I think it was his first one in 5 weeks. Casey Kane's on a downward slide. Clint Bowyer's on a downward slide. So this is a race that you might not necessarily want to start 3 of those drivers, but you do want to mark it down as a race to evaluate how they're doing. The one driver that you do want to start that you're going to assume is probably going to snap out of his funk is Jimmy Johnson. No one's been better over the past 6 races than him at Dover. He's got an average finish of 4.33. He's got back-to-back victories. He's got another victory in 2012. He's got a top 5 in fall of 2012. He's got 9 victories overall. There's just no way that you can't rank him.
Win too. That was the one where he got penalized, right?
Yep. 17th last spring, probably would have won if he hadn't. Was that the restart penalty?
It was the jump start. Yeah, the jump start in the early race.
So. Yeah, he'd be right up there. Might have 10 victories if it hadn't been for that penalty. And his problems have been somewhat self-inflicted. I think the 16th place finish back in 2010 was another penalty. That one, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. I kind of remember that. I don't remember specifically what the penalty was, but there was something there.
Yeah, I think it was a speeding penalty on pit road.
Yeah.
Pit road late in the race. So. All of his problems since the beginning of 2008 have been self-inflicted. So long as he doesn't self-inflict another penalty, he should finish in the top 5. He doesn't, then we know that there's a problem in the number 48 team. If he doesn't finish in the top 5 here, his season's got to be in quite a bit more question. That said, he's still got a good run of top 12 finishes. Right now, he's got a, where is he? Current 7-race top 12 streak going. So even while he struggles, he's getting top 10s. So in a salary cap game where you got a little bit more flexibility, he's never stopped being fantasy relevant. When we get down to the Yahoo game, we're going to talk about his lack of relevance for a little bit, or his lack of strength for a little bit. That is going to turn around this week. Beyond him, you've got, I think Jeff Gordon is probably the second-ranked driver overall, second strongest driver overall. He entered this spring with a 3-race top 5 streak, had a top 5 capable car until they went the wrong way on the final adjustment, which is the wrong time to get that adjustment wrong, and he dropped back to 15. Can't predict if that'll happen again. You can't assume that it's going to happen again. So he should be able to finish in the top 10, top 5, actually. And then you've got Keselowski and Logano and Harvick. Those 4 drivers, Gordon, Keselowski, Logano, Harvick, have been the class of the field. So at any given week right now, regardless of what their record is on a given track, you've got to think of them as top 5 capable drivers and treat them accordingly. If they're on your salary cap roster, no reason to get rid of them. if you can move some stuff around and get any of those drivers without giving up a lot at the bottom end, you might as well do it, because I think they're going to the ones that are going to contend all the way to at least through the eliminator round, and those may be the 4 drivers that make it to Homestead. If Johnson gets his strength back, then one of those 4 drivers is going to drop out, and Talladega is going to well, actually, I think they'll all make it to the eliminator round, and that's going to be interesting if those 4 drivers make it, because who's going to drop? It's going to a bad finish could be a 10th place finish among those 4 drivers in that final round. So, but those are the guys.
It'd be really interesting. I want to stop you there and go back here for a second to something that you said just excuse me, a minute ago, where you said, if you don't have either of those drivers, being the Penske drivers or Harvick, I think, in your roster, and you can adjust things so you don't, without giving up too much. Define not giving up too much for me and for maybe players that aren't as expert as you are. I mean, what would you be willing to give up? What type of drivers would you give up to get one of those guys into your? Maybe you're giving up 2 drivers, right, to get one of those guys.
You're probably going to have to, and I think that's the key. I think of salary cap game still as a tiered system. You've got the top tier, the middle tier, and the bargain basement drivers. The top tier are the marquee drivers that are capable of winning any week, and even when they struggle, you're not going to give them up. They're the Johnsons, Gordons, Harvicks, Keselowskis, Logano's. The middle tier, usually if it's a 5-man roster or a 6-man roster, you can get 2 marquee drivers, 2 middle tier drivers, and then manage your bargain basement. So in this case, you might want to give up one of your middle range drivers and take another bargain basement driver if you can identify someone that you think has a generally positive trend. And then you've got 2 bargain basement drivers, 2 or 3 marquee drivers, and 1 middle range driver. Right now, we've got some good dark horses. So Jamie McMurray is trending up. He'd be a middle tier driver. Kyle Larson's trending up. He'd be a middle tier driver. You probably wouldn't want to get rid of them. But if your middle tier driver is someone like Denny Hamlin, who's struggling, or Ryan Newman, who's more likely to finish in the 6th to 15th place range instead of
a Roush driver,
right? Then those are the guys that you might be willing to get rid of and take a bargain basement driver, give up 10 positions per race on them to be able to get one of the marquee drivers who isn't finishing 10 positions always ahead of Ryan Newman necessarily, or Denny Hamlin necessarily, but are earning more points in games that have more than just a single point structure. If you're just getting points for finishing position, most of the games out there have some sort of tiered point structure, and like the NASCAR game, you're going to want to get people who are dominating races and able to earn more points, not just finish well.
Interesting. Okay, I didn't mean to interrupt your train of thought, but I just that question came to my mind and want to know what you were thinking in that case.
So we think in terms of the marquee drivers. They're fairly well defined. They change a little bit from week to week. The middle tier drivers are the ones that are much more likely to be different and be track specific. This week, if you want to roll the dice, Clint Bowyer would be a good one to roll the dice on. Michael Waltrip Racing has struggled. Brian Vickers had a good run last week. So they've had they've shown flashes of speed, but they haven't been particularly consistent. Clint Bowyer has been struggling, but he enters the week with a 7-race top 10 streak at Dover. This is one of those tracks that's been good to him throughout his career. If he's going to turn things around, this is going to be when he does it. So this is a track that he's a good gamble, and I think he belongs on most fantasy rosters. I would not take him if it kept me from getting one of that third marquee driver or that second really good marquee driver. But I'd look at him otherwise. Dale Earnhardt Jr. Don't know where his salary cap is in some games. He's probably, I still think of him as a mid-tier driver, mostly because he struggled for a period. Uh, Here at Dover, though, he's got a streak of 5 consecutive 11th or better finishes. So he's about to take the mantle from Jimmy Johnson if Jimmy Johnson gives it up at Dover. And Jimmy Johnson got the mantle from Jeff Gordon. So you've got a history of success here. For your dark horse drivers, for your bargain basement drivers, I think you look and see who ran well this spring, but doesn't automatically come to mind as a great pick in every track. And I would put Paul Menard, Tony Stewart, and Martin Truex Jr. in that category. All three of them scored top tens this spring. They're not great. They're not hugely expensive. Tony Stewart, if you've got him, you probably want to make him a race day decision and see how he practices. If he doesn't practice well, then ignore him. But Menard and Truex, I think, make good solid picks for cheaper drivers. So far as bargain basement drivers go, it's kind of a pick 'em this week. This is a track that rewards repetition, that rewards experience, and there aren't a lot of drivers down in the very bottom who have enough experience here to separate them from the crowd. Maybe an Austin Dillon with a couple of races here. Danica Patrick, if she's cheap enough, has 4 races here, mostly been in the 20s, I think, and she's someone that might make a good bargain basement pick.
All right. Well, before we get to the other game type that we talk about every week, which is the big Yahoo Sports game, let's tell you a little bit about where you can read Dan's other information. This is a great show, and you get great real-time, late in the week advice from Dan here, but you can also read his extensive fantasy racing article at yahoosports.com. That's probably live now, right, Dan, for the week?
Yeah.
How many pages this week?
Been up since Tuesday night. Only 21. Lost a page last week.
Only 21 pages. He's sloughing off this week. But anyway, it's the best fantasy racing advice and analysis that you can get anywhere on the internet, and it's every week at yahoosports.com, and it's authored by my my partner on the show, Dan Beaver. Also, Dan writes for rotoworld.com with a different set of unique fantasy racing analysis and advice there too. So take a look at that as well, both of those places. And then if you aren't already following Dan on Twitter, follow him at Fantasy Race. You can follow me on Twitter at OnPitRow, but don't pay any attention to what I say about fantasy unless it's laughing at myself. Okay, so now we're going to the big Yahoo game, which is we talk about every week. What are you saying about Dover this weekend for the Yahoo game?
Well, it'll come as no surprise that the Hendrick mates are the ones that are going to top the Group A. I think that Jimmy Johnson has not been as strong in Group A as everyone expected him to. But the benefit to that is that probably allocation management is not a concern whatsoever. And as soon, if he turns the wick up, then you could run the year out with as many allocations as you have. All of the tracks that are in the chase are good for him. He's great on the similarly configured mile-and-a-half tracks. We've got Charlotte, Kansas, and Texas coming up. But if you're going to, even before he tips his hand, even before he shows his hand, he's got to be on your roster at Dover. That 6-race average finish of 4.3 just makes him impossible to overlook. It might not if he had been struggling outside the top 15 for the last several races, but the fact that he's just finishing somewhere between 6th and 12th limits his attractiveness in Yahoo Group A, but it doesn't limit his attractiveness overall, and the team's got a good enough set of notes from which to work that they should be able to just put a great baseline setup on there, be strong as they come off the hauler tomorrow, and run strong all weekend. Jeff Gordon, Last week's cut tire, he was about to pass for fifth. This has happened to him at least once before, and he rebounded immediately. The only caveat this week is he can't afford to have another two bad races in a row, or risk dropping out of the top 12 in points. There are enough people behind him. He's got a good enough point cushion over the 13th place guy in points. I believe it's 21 points. That shouldn't be an issue. But if the team thinks it's an issue and he's a little less aggressive, or they're a little less aggressive on tuning the engine, then he could finish in the 6th to 10th range instead of the top 5 range. So of the two, I like Johnson a little bit better, but Gordon's my second guy. Harvick, running strong everywhere. He, at some point or another, he will contend for a victory. He had a bad race this spring, or a bad finish this spring, but it's after he cut a valve stem on his tire while leading. I think he made contact with someone, I think, under caution, and cut that valve stem, or he made contact right before the caution and didn't know that the tire was going soft. He lost a lap, finished outside the top 10, but I think that was an aberration. So those are the three drivers that are going to be the most attractive in Group A. In Group B, you've got Keselowski, Logano, no-brainers, but the question remains, how many allocations do you have for them? Last week, when Keselowski swept almost every practice session, it was a good time to go ahead and think of him as, yep, I'm going to use one of my last two allocations. The same with Joey Logano when he sweeps. If you're down to one or two allocations, but you still want to keep that one allocation remaining because they're going to get qualification bonus points. Last week, don't usually toot my own horn, but I had the 4 top qualifiers. That was 19 points. And 19 points can make a big difference in really tight leagues. So you get the pole sitter and the outside pole sitter on your roster somehow, you've got 15 points right there. And that's worth having. So you want to hang on to those guys.
How much do you put into the decision to pick a driver? How much of the qualifying ability do you weigh in there? And can you put a percentage on it? Is it 10% of the decision?
It changes week by week, and I think that's one reason that you want to be reading the Yahoo stories. We do 2 of them each week. There's a preview, and then there is a practice qualification story that goes up right after qualification. In that, I tend to talk about the trends by track. At Dover, it's incredibly important. I think only 2 or 3 drivers, I'm doing this by memory, have overcome qualifications of 25th or worse in the most recent 6 races at Dover. So at Dover, qualifying is extremely important. If your driver qualifies outside the top 25, he's probably not going to finish in the top 10. That's going to factor in your decision in Groups A and Group B, and probably Group C if you've got Larson, Dillon, Patrick covering around there, and one of them qualifies inside the top 15, and one of them qualifies outside the top 25. That's your tiebreaker, and you're going to start the driver who starts closer to the front.
Good stuff. All right, so we're down in the B. Anybody else to pick in B besides those Penske guys, or what else do you look at there?
Well, you've got to, because you can't just run the table with Penske at this stage of the season. So Jamie McMurray, this is not necessarily one of his better tracks, but he's on such a roll overall at the moment that he's hard to overlook. I think he's a driver to pick here. His Dover record, whoops. Doing this at a distance on my laptop. He hasn't had a top 10 since back in about 2008, but his last 2 finishes have been top 15s. If he didn't have his current streak of top 10s going, then you would probably say, yeah, he's probably going to finish outside somewhere in that mid-teens, mid to low teens again, and might not make him a very attractive driver. But because he's got the top 10 streak going in the last 3 races or so, he elevates himself, and he's got a good chance of getting another top 10. The Ganassi teams have something to prove. It seems like they're putting this is something's different this year than what they've seen than what we've seen in the past. Either they're spending a little more money to get the speed that they need, or this just happens to be one of the good years for them, or the addition of Kyle Larson and subtraction of Juan Pablo Montoya makes it better than a 1+1=2 scenario. It makes it a 1+1=3 scenario somehow, and you don't have to understand why that's happening. You just have to be willing to roll with it and take the driver.
Right.
AJ Allmendinger has three top tens. Had three top tens in I think the 6 races before his suspension. His last 2 races have been in the 20s. But now that he's got himself into 10th in the point standings and needs another strong run this week in order to advance to the next round, I think that's the added motivation that team needed to get a top 12 finish, somewhere between 8th and 15th, and that makes him one of the next most likely drivers to finish in that range. And in this case, I think you're going to play the odds. Ryan Newman could finish really well. Denny Hamlin could finish pretty well, but they're both down on the cusp of missing the next round of the playoffs, and they might have to be a little conservative, or they've just had some bad luck recently, and you got to factor that into the handicaps as well. So the next 2 drivers that are on my radar screen would be Jay Murray, AJ Allmendinger, then next probably Paul Menard because he had the top 10 here in the spring. And that's who I would choose for my next 2 drivers, knowing that I'm probably not going to start Keselowski or Logano unless they sweep practice like Keselowski did last week.
All right, and that leaves us the C drivers this week. Again, it comes down to how many slots you have left for Dillon and Larson, I suppose.
Yeah, no.
Danica Patrick would be, I would think, a legitimate pick this week.
I think it's going to come down to those 3 every week, and hopefully you've got 8 allocations between those 3 drivers, so that you could, or 7 allocations between those 3 drivers, so that you could run out the season, and then just put anybody at random in for Talladega. If you don't, then Allgaier becomes the next most likely driver, and you've got to decide which races to put him in. That decision is going to come on drivers' tracks, tracks that reward feedback more than that does horsepower. Dover, Bristol, Martinsville, Phoenix fit in the category of drivers' tracks. So if you're going to need to start Allgaier, think in terms of those 4 tracks and decide how many times you're going to need to start Allgaier. That's where you're going to think about him, and then spread your allocations for Larson, Patrick, Dillon onto the other tracks. Dillon is probably going to be best on similarly configured mile-and-a-half tracks, or Dillon's going to be closest to Larson on similarly configured mile-and-a-half tracks. I think Larson's going to be the top C performer and the top rookie in all 8 remaining races, with, well, 7. I don't count Talladega as a race. And anybody trying to predict who's going to finish ahead of who at Talladega is just, it's an exercise in futility. But in the 7 races where drivers control their fate, I think Larson's going to be the best C and the best rookie driver every time. If he's not, it's going to be an odd situation. So you look for when Dillon and Patrick are going to be close enough to him to minimize the damage that not starting Larson's going to do, knowing that you can't start him in every race. Here, I would rank Patrick a little bit ahead of Dillon because I think experience counts. Patrick has 4 races under a belt. Dillon has 2, and those extra 2 races I think make Danica a little more attractive than Austin.
All right. Just as a caveat, after all that great advice you've just listened to for the last 30 minutes or so, on the NASCAR Hangout on Pit Row this week, Dan and I both picked Jimmy Johnson to win the race, so put that in your quiver, because there are a couple of jinx things out there about Beaver and myself when we pick somebody. So So just keep that one in mind. But I think those are solid picks. This is one of the tracks I think probably is more predictable than many, and a lot of that thanks to Jimmy Johnson, I guess. But any final thoughts about Dover before we sign out for this week?
You cut out a little bit there, so if you're done talking.
I say any final thoughts about Dover before we close this one out this week?
Be aware that this is a track that is prone to big one crashes. The straights are narrow. If someone wrecks coming off of either turn 2 or turn 4, they can clog that straightaway up in a hurry, and that can alter things. So your other tiebreaker are drivers that tend to run at the front of the pack. One of the charts that is in the Yahoo Fantasy Preview is laps in the top 10. I believe it's on page 8. Jimmy Johnson, Kyle Busch, Clint Boyer, Matt Kenseth, Jeff Gordon, Brad Keselowski, Casey Kane are the drivers with the best percentage of top 10 laps. That becomes a tiebreaker as well. You want drivers that are more likely to run up front and be ahead of what potentially could be a track clogging big one crash. Okay, there's your last great tip of the week. Again, he's Dan Beaver. Follow him on Twitter at Fantasy Race. Read his stories, fantasy racing stories at yahoosports.com and rotoworld.com every week. And come back and join us next week, next Thursday, 3 o'clock Eastern time. We'll talk about where are we going next? Kansas. Kansas, that's right. We're going to Kansas. Another one of those similarly configured 1.5-mile tracks that I'm practicing saying. So we'll work on that this week. Thanks for joining us today, folks. Dan, thanks for your time. I'll talk to you soon. And everybody enjoy the racing at Dover this weekend.